All right, it is now 4 o'clock on August 25th, and this is the Great War Discussion Group. We are going to talk today about the reasons why the German offensive of August 1914 failed to reach its conclusion by encircling Paris and forcing a French defeat, leading to the stalemate that we now call the Western Front. We've heard a lecture on whether or not the Schlieffen Plan really existed, but there's no question that the Germans worked on a battle plan originating in the last years of the 19th century and updated every year or so until it was finally put into place in 1914 with the invasion through Belgium and Luxembourg into France, with the object of knocking the French out of the war relatively quickly. Patrick has been interested in this question for some time. He has a military background, and he will be discussing this whole thing with us. Patrick, you're on.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you to everyone that's dialed in to hear my presentation. This is, Charlie mentioned something that's long fascinated me, actually. And so I did a bit of studying about it. And I'm going to offer you now essentially what I learned in my discovery. Okay, this was the opening statement. If you saw the email that was sent out a week ago, you'll have seen this already. So essentially, this is my interpretation of what occurred. And I want to tell you how and Germany ended up in this state. This is my agenda. We'll go through the origins, the dynamics, the opening moves, etc. And we'll just kind of flow on through here. Now, this presentation isn't going to really do a deep dive on particular battles or anything like that, but I want to do more of a kind of like a high-level cover of what occurred at that time in August of 1914. So we'll start out with the origins. And to me, this goes back to the Franco-Prussian War then and the formation of the German Empire. Again, I've made the comment before that, in my opinion, Bismarck was the greatest European statesman in the 19th century. He was very cunning, he was very smart, and he managed to essentially put Germany through a process of the unification wars, first against Denmark, Austria, and then finally with France, where he managed to assemble the constituent German states and form them into an empire through the successful prosecution of these wars, enabled, of course, by the German Chief of Staff, Moltke the Elder. To the left, you see the first German Kaiser, Wilhelm I, and on his left is his son, Frederick III. So what did this empire look like? Well, officially, it was a federal parliamentary constitutional monarchy, which is quite a mouthful, that essentially put the Kaiser as the head of state and the chancellor the head of government. Now, the Constitution was largely written by Bismarck, so there's no surprise that conferred upon him significant powers. But a lot of that was just essentially at the federal level. The 27 constituent states still carried a tremendous amount of autonomy. And the reason why is the empire consisted of 4 separate kingdoms and a dozen duchies and grand duchies, principalities, et cetera, et cetera. In order to unify this political organization, it really required a lot of buy-in for the various kings, princes, and dukes to be able to retain a lot of their own internal residual power. As a matter of fact, the 4 kingdoms prior to the unification all maintained embassies with one another, which made perfect sense. After the formation of the empire, those embassies remained in place and intact. The reality was that how the German inner workings functioned were really not addressed with the Constitution, with the thinking being, well, we'll work on that as things arise. And one example why that's the case is the second largest kingdom, Bavaria, was a very large, powerful, prosperous kingdom where Roman Catholicism was the principal religion, and of course Russia was principally Lutheran. So in order to work through these issues, the thinking was we'll just work things through as time goes on amongst the constituent states. And that seemed to work out fairly well. Now, the other thing I want to point out is Bismarck did create a Reichstag or a parliament, and there was male suffrage, which essentially was eligible males 25 years and above. Now, the members of the government were basically conservative traditionalists that were vested in the monarchies, vested in the hierarchical institution that the empire embraced. However, we all know there were millions of laborers, tradesmen, workers, blue collars, small businesses who trended towards the left side of the political spectrum, which is not all surprising in that the Reichstag, consisting of multiple parties, the majority party was the Socialist Democratic Party, which again was the only way that those people, the common people, could have their voice heard. However, within the Constitution, the Bundesrat, which we would call an upper chamber, really had the ability to take some of the legislation they approved, and if it was a little out of bounds of what they wanted, they had the ability or the authority to modify or change the laws that the Reichstag passed. Now, the ministries, of course, were the typical functionalities or functionaries that you would find in any large state. And lastly, the army was a completely separate institution. It was not under the authority of any of those other governmental institutions. And the reason why that existed or was in place, you'd have to go back to the founding, essentially, of the Prussian kingdom, which started out as a very small, poor, rural agrarian state. And it was the army and its success in terms of prosecuting wars that allowed the expansion of the kingdom into the empire, which gave it a special place of veneration. So it had its own distinct individual place within the hierarchy. So let's take a little closer look at the army. Within the army, there were four specific power centers. The first one, of course, was the Kaiser with his military cabinet. Now, this consisted of senior generals and admirals who were handpicked by the Kaiser. They were there to advise him, to consult with him, recommend promotions, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the fact that the Kaiser handpicked him I wouldn't call necessarily a positive process. The Kaiser, which we'll talk about more later, his personality, et cetera, but he liked to be flattered. He liked to hear amusing stories. He liked to be reminded consistently of how wonderful he was. So he did not have many contrarians in his military cabinet, which is something that you'd probably really want to see in a healthy organization. The War Ministry, that provided the administrative, the logistical, the training, the development of weapons, and also the solicitation of funds from the Reichstag. And this was headed by an active army general, by a gentleman by the name of Falkenhayn. And we'll hear more about him later. The third power center would be the Great General Staff. Now, this was a unique organization, which was really it was really very effective in terms of how they functioned. In order to be a member of that staff, you had to go through an extensive testing process, and you had to essentially show your competence. You had to show your work ethic, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very prestigious organization that was unique at the time, and in fact was eventually copied by the other great powers, specifically France and Great Britain. The fourth power center would be the Army Inspectorates. These were headed up by retired generals, and you can see the organization on the chart. They each had about 3 to 4 Army corps within their boundaries. The corps were essentially established somewhat similarly what we would see our National Guard today. In other words, the soldiers within those corps were from the same towns, neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. But the advantage of this was it gave a place for the soldiers to be garrisoned, for the soldiers to be trained, for the soldiers to essentially be going through their steps in the active army. The interesting thing was within this organization, per the German siege law of 1871, when the empire went to war, the inspectorates reported directly to the Kaiser. The problem with this was during the war, there was a significant demand for goods and services. Now, these army generals had no political training or background, and therefore, during the war, there were often clashes with the local political authorities over those goods and services as things became scarce. But their connection to the Kaiser, of course, gave them the upper hand. And also, as time went on, pressure mounted. They were very brusque in their handling with the local political authorities, which caused a lot of friction. And if we go even further into the war, at the time when Hindenburg and Ludendorff were now in charge of the great general staff, you can see now where the claims of dictatorship were occurring, because it was essentially the chief of the general staff dealing directly with the inspectorate commanders, causing a lot of friction within the empire itself. Now I want to discuss what I call the great power dynamics, which occurred across Europe after the formation of the empire. The first one, I call this the shifting landscape, was after the defeat of the French in 1871. They immediately knew that they had a powerful new neighbor on their border, a hostile neighbor, and they knew they needed to immediately seek allies. So they reached out to Russia and created an alliance in 1892. Now, the fact that Republican France was joining forces with the Russian emperor and Russia was really pretty much a significant event. But France thought they needed to do this. It was what best for them. However, by aligning themselves with Russia, that signaled to Germany, in their mind, that they are now surrounded or circled by hostile powers, which, again, was not something they responded positively towards. Now, concurrent with that, the Kaiser read a book by Alfred Thayer Mahan about sea power, and he was quite taken with it. Now, his naval commander, a gentleman named Tirpitz, also read it, and knowing the enormous German steel industry, German wealth, and German manpower, inveighed upon the Kaiser to build a fleet to rival Great Britain. And the Kaiser gave the permission to proceed with this once they managed to secure the funding from the Reichstag. And what this did was really change Great Britain's diplomacy, their foreign policy in terms of how they operated. They knew that that fleet was a threat to them. Now, the Germans claimed the fleet was only to oversee their colonial empire, which they were in the process of building. But British spies knew that the ships they were building had very small crew compartments and short ranges, which meant they were only being built for a battle in the North Sea, which could only mean conflict with Great Britain. Therefore, Great Britain reached out to Japan to ask them to more or less oversee their Pacific possessions, and they brought their ships home to their waters in order to oversee the German fleet. And of course, all this is doing is just causing more tension, more issues, and more concerns. All the other items I'm talking about, the Kaiser's foreign missteps, it was just kind of his personality. And there were often times he would make public statements or do things that his foreign ministry would then have to go clean up and police up after him. So we get to now the German army, and what I refer to as a strategic dilemma. After the war ended with France, the chief of the Great General Staff, von Moltke the Elder, determined Russia and France had greater strength than Germany, and his thought was we will go to a strategic defensive posture in the event of war, and then we will attack if the opportunity is ripe. After he retired, Waldersee came in, and he was more or less a placeholder only for 2 years. When he retired, the gentleman named Schlieffen came in. Now, Schlieffen, when he studied Moltke's plans, decided that, no, we have enough requisite strength to fight an offensive campaign. And he began building several plans, which I'm not going to get into at all. In any case, David Pendleton did a great job talking about that a couple of months ago. What I'm going to talk about instead is the overall concept. Now, the thinking was to use the lowlands, that is Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, as an invasion route. Why? Well, for the past millennium, that was the invasion route of all the warring armies, given the terrain. The southern European mountain chains, the Vosges and the Alps, really precluded any invading armies. So the planning was then done more or less, not more or less, it was done in a vacuum. The Great General Staff developed an operational plan and not a strategy. And what I mean by the operational plan, it was done through a strict military prism. There was no input at all from any of the other elements or ministries within the German government. It was just the army determining how to effect this lightning campaign through the lowlands. And again, what this did was present a fait accompli then to the German government, because it was an all or nothing thing. There were no options. There were no other courses of actions available. There were no plan Bs. So really, what the Great General Staff did was they essentially were gambling. Now, there's a difference between a gamble and a risk in military planning. If you assume risk, if you fail, you can still recover. If you gamble, it's essentially going all in. It's like an initial poker hand, and you're holding a decent hand, and you put all your chips into the pot. And if you lose, you're out. Well, that's essentially what the German army handed its government. On top of that, because this plan was secret, it wasn't really known throughout the government. And for instance, the foreign minister was aware of the plan, but his embassies weren't. So when Germany went to war, the embassies didn't have a strategic communications plan to talk about why they were violating the Belgian neutrality. They didn't have what we would call today like the press kits and the talking points to rationalize why this needed to be done. So they weren't prepared for it. And it really put Germans in a bind. Now let's look at the army that had to execute this plan. One of the things that the German army did was they went to a conscript system. And what that was essentially universal conscription for all eligible males. And they would bring the men in, they would go through their 2-year service obligation, and then they would just progress through a period based on their ages into the German military. In other words, they would stay associated with the military in some form or fashion. And what this did was it gave Germany an immense pool of manpower to call upon in the time of need. Now, you'll notice the line that says active army 54% eligible. What I'm getting at there is out of the eligible men, only 54% had to do the service obligation. The German army didn't have the capacity to bring all their men into the army. They didn't have the garrisons, they didn't have the equipment, and most importantly, they didn't have the budget. So it was only 54% of the males. but that was still enabled them to have a very large standing army of 880,000 men. Now, the other thing Moltke the Younger did was he also improved then the German autumn maneuvers when he assumed the role. What he did was he cleaned them up, he made them a little more realistic. And these maneuvers were very handy in terms of enabling the senior leaders in the German army to get used to handling large bodies of troops. In other words, they understood the time and space requirements of maneuvering these troops around the battlefields, which was very effective. On the other hand, they still retained a lot of the residual habits of mass charges, mass cavalry charges, et cetera, et cetera. But again, that was just in line with the thinking of the day. Now let's look at the other side of the coin, the three principal opponents that the Germans faced in August of 1914. First, we're going to start with Belgium. Now, Belgium was officially a neutral country. They had extreme wealth, all out of proportion to the size of the country, and that was leveraged largely through their African empire, their colonies. They were officially a neutral country. Now, even though their sympathies really lay with the French and Great Britain, they were very, very careful not to have any association or not any military planning with those two countries because they didn't want to do anything at all to provoke their powerful neighbor to the east. What they did do was invest an enormous amount of money into building a fortress system along the key river lines in the country. These were very sophisticated and they were assumed to be effective. As far as the army goes, the army was underfunded, not particularly motivated, and it was really no prestige or kind of like benefit from being in the army. So it wasn't really something that was desired or sought. Now, the British historian Hugh Strachan called the Belgium foreign policy international neutral purity and strategic absurdity. And his point there is, yes, you're a neutral nation, but you're not really doing everything you can to defend your borders, at least by reaching out in secret to your friendly foreign policy powers. I'm sorry about that. I think I went to, okay, here we go, the French. All right. After the Franco-Prussian War ended, the French, aside from the utter humiliation and anger over their defeat, immediately began determining that they needed to fortify their eastern border. So their senior army engineer, a gentleman named Riviere, began implementing a fortress system along the border. Now, on the right-hand side of the chart, I don't expect you to read that text, but what I'm just trying to show you is how extensive and how thorough this fortress system was. It was very comprehensive, and again, it deterred the Germans, frankly. As the decades went on after the war, the German army doctrine began changing. They decided that the offensive was the key to battle. In other words, what they were doing was they were reaching back to their Napoleonic roots. Now, the French army truly believed that a motivated soldier with a rifle and a bayonet charging, led by officers with drummers and bugles blaring, was the key to victory. Their artillery development also kind of was more or less halted. They had produced this fine cannon, and I have an image of it on the lower left, the 75 millimeter, which of course had the innovative recoil system. It was a very fine weapon and a very effective one. It was also very light and very maneuverable, which then tied in then with the French offensive doctrine of attacking. The idea that these cannons would be rolling along with the attacking infantry and be able to be put in position immediately and lay down effective fires. The problem, though, was their heavy artillery development was pretty much ended, which put them in a real bind at the start of the war. Now, the evolving doctrine then led to the strategy of Plan 17. Plan 17 was essentially the offensive attack into the principal territories of Alsace and Lorraine, which Germany had taken from France after the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War. And again, politically, the French army had no choice. They had to first and foremost reclaim those territories. And that was pretty much a political directive, which tied into the whole offensive posture of this army. Now, the French also went into the conscript system as well. Now, they had a much smaller population, 48 million to the Germans, 65 million, but they were still able to maintain a large standing army, pretty much commensurate with the Germans of 820,000 soldiers. But if you'll notice, they had to take 83% of their eligible military manpower to make that work. And the simple accounting trick of making it a 3-year service obligation vice a 2-year. Now, that was a fairly recent innovation. Only about 1913, the French Parliament passed that law, but the French soldiers in garrison, when they found out about that, were very angered. And the point was, while service in the German army, when you were called up to do your service obligation, it was a point of pride. It was prestigious. It was a slap on the back, and your parents could be proud. In the French army, the young men saw the service as something you have to do, something you knock out, and then you get on with your life. So there was kind of a different mentality or culture within how the respective armies were viewed and how army service was looked at as well. And the British. Now, the British Army was really, I don't want to call them a constabulary, but frankly, it was much smaller because they were definitely the little brother service to the British High Seas Fleet. The service, they did not have conscription. What they had were they were regulars. In other words, when you signed up in the service in the Army, you do a 7-year and then years beyond that. It was a professional force. It was a very effective force, too, because the soldiers, while they're stationed in the overseas empire, oftentimes were combat veterans. In fact, the bulk of the soldiers in the regular army were Boer War veterans, which had been fought a dozen years prior. Now, there was a lot of manpower available, but again, they were scattered throughout the entire globe. The British Army didn't have any major land contingency operations planned. They didn't have a large army, but they did have contingency plans for global hotspots throughout the empire. The army was also very decentralized because it was seen that the local commanders throughout the empire knew best how to train the soldiers for whatever contingencies would occur, uprisings, rebellions, revolts, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in 1906, the British Foreign Secretary, a man named Edward Grey, who was an interventionist by nature, sent the director of his senior staff college over to talk to his counterpart, Ferdinand Foch. The idea was to talk about a potential of the British Army sending forces over to the continent to ally with France in the event of conflict with Germany. Now, of course, Grey could not afford to let the Germans learn about this, so he was very astute by sending his a college director over, because what he could do if the Germans found out about this, he could just claim it was a purely academic discussion. This is theoretical. We're not really planning on doing anything. It was just kind of like a what if case. Now, he also made it clear to Wilson, though, that they had no political or military authority to promise anything. Wilson didn't quite see it that way, but he ultimately determined that a force of 6 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division and an expeditionary force going to France would essentially be the force that would enable the Allies to have success against a potential conflict with Germany. All right, now let's get into the actual campaign itself. First, I want to talk about the German mobilization. And this was a very impressive operation. And I'm going to offer, too, and again, I say this partly tongue in cheek, but To me, this was the General Staff's greatest achievement over the duration of the entire war. A lot of years went into the planning of this operation. It was truly an incredible event. Now, mobilization plans were, of course, top secret within the respective great powers. And the reason why is you have these mass armies and the ability to assemble, equip, transport, and then send to the assembly areas was an indicator of where potential attacks would come from. Now, the Germans carried this off flawlessly. This was an incredible achievement because you can see the standing army of 880,000 went up to nearly 4 million. All the horses, the equipment that they managed to assemble in just under 4 weeks' time was absolutely incredible. And again, a remarkable achievement that they managed to effect. Now, this chart, I'm very busy and a lot of information here, but really all I want to convey to you is the Germans, of course, were attacking through the Low Countries. And the whole philosophy behind that was, of course, to avoid the French fortress system. And concurrently, the French Plan 17, of course, was kind of like the opposite effect. You can almost see the armies are working clockwise against each other. Joffre has his armies attacking from the south into Alsace-Lorraine, which he adamantly was more or less told, you will reclaim those territories. Joffre also assumed that the German center would be Wake, so he had another attack going through the German center, based essentially near the Ardennes, in order to strike into Germany at what he considered the weak point, and then enable the armies in the south to have success. Lastly, the British Expeditionary Force, consisting of 6 divisions. The war minister in Great Britain initially said, no, you're going to get 4 divisions initially, 2 arriving later. He held 2 back. One was to stay in to essentially safeguard England and Scotland against a potential German maritime invasion. And then the other one was stationed in Ireland, not necessarily to defend Ireland. This is the era of the Troubles, the Irish Republican Army. They were really maintained in Ireland to keep their feet on the necks of the Irish Republican Army. Now, the 2 things the French commander was told when he took this army over to France was preservation of the expeditionary force was his highest priority, because essentially the British were committing their entire army to this effort. Secondly, he was told that his command is an independent one. In other words, if the French generals give him instructions that he found would probably put the expeditionary force in peril, he had the ability to deny or not to account for what they were asking. Now, one last component. I mentioned before that the mobilization plan, specifically called the mobilization transport plan, was really truly it was work of very professional, competent men. On the other hand, when the Great General Staff began transmitting orders to the armies, one of the things that the German 7th Army commander received in his order was instructions that 9 Italian divisions were going to be on his left flank to help secure it. He got that in early August 1914. Now, Italy, which ostensibly was a member of the Central Powers Alliance, had already declared their neutrality because the political leadership and the army leadership wanted nothing to do with this war, mainly because they had participated in the previous Balkan wars, and the army was in no condition to fight. But if you're the German 7th Army commander and you're receiving an operations order that's saying you're going to have Italian divisions on your flank when you know that Italy's not in the war, it kind of puts some doubts in your mind of what's coming from your higher headquarters. Now let's look at the German commanders that are going to execute this very complex plan. We'll start on the left with the Kaiser himself. The Kaiser was a very interesting character. I've read a biography about him, and he is a person that's long fascinated me. He really embraced the whole culture of Prussian militarism. He thrived on that. Now, he was very smart. He was very interested in science and technology and innovation. He was very proud of his country's contributions to those areas over the years. But on the other hand, he was very erratic. He was he mood swings. Mood swings were a hallmark of his entire persona. Um, I think the best word that could describe him would be a dilettante, and again, defined as someone who professes a great love of something, say classical music. When you talk to them about it, you find out they don't know anything about classical music because the individual doesn't have the energy, the interest, or the desire to really plunge himself into it. Well, that was Kaiser Wilhelm. I mean, he would put on the uniforms, he would participate in the autumn maneuvers, but he was really doing it on a real peripheral level. And since the construct of the empire at the federal level, everything ran through him. So you could see this is going to cause significant problems as time goes on. His principal right hand man, Helmuth Moltke the Younger, he was the nephew of the elder. Now, he was capable. He knew his business, but he was very insecure. And he was not popular either because he did not have the persona of a Prussian general. In fact, he was very much into philosophy, the arts. He and his wife dabbled in cults. Not something that your Prussian general was going to be into, if you will. On top of that, he is really his health posture is very poor. He had a bad heart, and I want to point out two specific encounters with him and the Kaiser. The first one on the 1st of August. Now, very quickly, there was a point in time during the build up to the war where they caught word that Great Britain would convince France to stay out of the conflict so that Germany would only have to face Russia. The Kaiser made the comment to Moltke, oh, you can turn all your armies around and head them off to the east. Now, that just absolutely devastated Moltke because not having the knowledge, and again, you are the commander in chief, not having the understanding that the time and space and logistical issues of turning 7 large armies around hundreds of thousands of tons of equipment, horses, transport, and everything else, and shipping into the East was a sheer impossibility. But again, that gets back to my point earlier about how the general staff created an operational plan where there was no course of action B. There were no other options. It was only a throw in that bound the leadership to one course of action. Moltke, when Moltke told the Kaiser, we can't do this, the Kaiser's retort was, that's not what your uncle would have told me. Now, when Moltke the Younger was appointed by the Kaiser, Moltke is in insecurity specifically stated, you only chose me because of my name. And of course, the Kaiser assured him, no, that's not the case. Well, clearly now, the Kaiser confirmed to Moltke with that statement. That's exactly why he brought him on as the chief, because he wanted that reflected glory of the name in his role as the Kaiser. Now, the second encounter was on the 7th of August. And at this time, the key fortress in Liege had fallen. And the Kaiser's reaction was to go up to Moltke and bear hug him and begin kissing him on both cheeks. Again, not a particularly professional move, but this is kind of the mood swings then that Moltke had to tolerate with the Kaiser, his ups, his downs, from unbridled joy to abject depression. That's what the Kaiser presented. And that was not necessarily what you wanted to see in a man who had such tremendous power and authority. As far as the German commanders themselves, you can see they're a mix of long-serving professional officers. The two key men would be the First Army and Second Army commanders, Kluck and Bülow. Now, those two gentlemen were actually they were very competent. And they were very good. But I deliberately put the ages of all these commanding officers on the chart because I want you to see, think about it, 68 years old, and you are fighting essentially a war that you determine is an existential threat. commanding an army of hundreds of thousands, you think of the stress, you think of the responsibilities, and you really think these gentlemen at that age in life really have the ability to manage these operations. You kind of think that maybe you get some younger blood. But on the other hand, these general officers were what we would call due course. In other words, they were at the exact stage in life that you would be within that army, because service in the German army was really more or less a lifelong commitment. So their ages were perfectly aligned with the German process at that time. The two commanders, Klug, Bülow, both Prussians, very arrogant, very condescending, etc. The Third Army commander was a Saxon. And again, you had to understand the sensibilities of constituent formations within the German Empire. Saxon was a kingdom. They were going to have a general officer then commanding an army, and they went with Hausen, who had been a former army, war minister within Saxon. And the problem with him was he was insecure as well, and he was extremely intimidated by the First and Second Army commanders. The Fourth Army commander was another crown prince, and again, why not? You're dealing with four kingdoms, and politically, you have to recognize in these kingdoms by handing out army commands to the crown princes. The Fifth Army commander was the German crown prince. That was the Kaiser's oldest son. But frankly, hey, what kind of a father can you be if you don't help give your son a lift, right? But again, the whole point here was to essentially burnish credentials and allow the young crown prince then to have a successful prosecution of war on his resume before he assumes the throne from his father. The Seventh Army commander, Haringen, good man, competent. The Sixth Army, Ruprecht, was the crown prince of the Kingdom of Bavaria, and he remarkably was actually very competent and popular. I threw the Eighth Army commander on there, Pritzwitz, mainly because he had a significant role to play. Though he wasn't part of the August campaign, he had the really crucial role of defending Eastern Germany against the Russian army. Now, Pritzwitz, describe him as basically a clown. He was a buffoon. He was in that role because he was one of the Kaiser's favorite. Pritzwitz knew how to entertain the Kaiser. He knew how to joke with him, tell him funny stories, and then consistently remind him how great a guy he was. So thus, he held that really crucial command of holding off the Russian armies as they were invading Eastern Prussia. Now over to the Allied leaders. Well, the three principles I'll focus on here. First, we'll start off with Joffre. Joffre was an interesting man. He was very unimaginative and stubborn. He wasn't very impressive, but the key facet with him is the French political structure trusted him. Understanding the French politics at the time, there were many army officers who were either papists, in other words, they were really bound with the Roman Catholic Church, which at one time in French society had a very powerful role. The second item were the monarchists, that is, the ones who really were not happy that, of course, the monarchy had been abolished a century ago, and really kind of like harbored feelings about the restoration of the ancient regime. Whereas Joffre, it was secular, had no interest in a king, and he was fairly competent. He had a very good record in the French the French colonies. So the politicians trusted him not to foment any dissension or anything like that. They could rely on him. And just to give you another idea about Joffre, when they were in the process of putting together Plan 17, Joffre, too, had the French army marching through the neutral Belgium and Dutch state or Holland's countries. He presented these plans to his government, and the political leadership immediately denied him, said, no, we are not moving through Belgium in order to outflank the German fortification system. And Joffre complied and essentially took those plans and set them aside. He didn't throw them away, but he essentially adhered to his political leadership. So here you have a case of a military man saying we need to violate a country's neutrality and the political leadership telling him no. Whereas over in the German side, the military in their manner presented it to their political leadership as a fait accompli, and it was accepted. And that essentially then just showed the world again the Prussian militarism was in fact a reality. The last thing I like to point out is his daily regimen consisted of an enormous lunch followed by a long nap, then going to work, and then getting a big dinner and going to sleep for 8 solid hours. Now, this daily regime he maintained all the way through the war while he was in that role, which I find incredibly remarkable. But again, that was Joffre. The second individual will be the King of Belgium. Now, constitutionally, he was the commander-in-chief of the army. He did have a chief of staff, but shortly after the war began, he took personal command. He's a very brave young man, very capable, and he was determined to preserve his country, and he kept his country in the war for the duration. Now we roll over to the British Expeditionary Force commander, Field Marshal French. I don't have much good to say about this gentleman. He was a stereotype, if you will, of a British general of this era. He was very class conscious. He frowned on new technology. It was beyond his capability, beyond his ken, if you will, to understand. To him, the war winner was a cavalry charge with men armed with lances and sabers. And he, in fact, in the early 1900s, when there's discussion about maybe we ought to relook how we use our cavalry, he just shut that down. No, I know what I know. And again, he made his claim to fame in the Boer War. I won't get into exactly what he did. A lot of what he did, which gave him that fame, was actually overblown and not quite the case. But he was given that command, and off to France he went. The French Army commanders, the 5 armies that were assembled in 1914, the 1st, 2nd, 4th Army commanders, all very competent and capable. The 3rd and 5th Army, Ruffy was he was competent, but after the initial battles, he pretty much his nerves got to him, so Joffre relieved him. And lastly, the 5th Army commander, who had a really important position and the battle space, was relieved on the 3rd of September. Reputationally, he was considered the best of the bunch. His nickname was the Lion of France. He was a protege of Foch, of Joffre. And again, it was a matter of just things just getting ahead of him, and where he was ultimately relieved. Okay, now I'm going to just briefly talk about what happened. A lot of information on the left hand of the slide. You can just go through that and absorb it. But we saw before then the Plan 17 and then the German plan to the north. What I'm going to show you here then is more or less what happened. So we know with the Germans, the main effort, the 1st and the 2nd armies were essentially the critical force, the component that were the war winners, if you will. And you could see the Germans had almost 600,000 men assembled for this particular effort. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th armies in the center, they were more or less kind of like, think about like an axle, and they would pivot in turn with the 1st and 2nd army. One way, if you can think about it, an infantry platoon marching in formation, and they're given a column left. The soldiers on the left side start taking little short steps. The soldiers on the outside start taking longer strides. That was kind of how the German armies were supposed to then maneuver as they effected this sweep through the north down to the south. The German 6th and 7th armies down to the south, of course, were the fixing force. The Germans knew the French were going to attack into Alsace-Lorraine to reconquer those territories. So they were essentially just to stay in their fortified positions and hold and defend. Next, the French Plan 17. The idea, again, Alsace and Lorraine liberation, if you will, and then the Third and Fourth Armies attacking into what Joffre assumed. Joffre's intelligence told him that the center of the German line was weak. What he didn't realize was that his armies were marching into a compilation of 400,000 soldiers, unbeknownst to him. And lastly, of course, the British Expeditionary Force brought in mainly through the French port of Le Havre, and they were then to assemble on the left-hand flank of the Fifth Army, commanded by General Landrezic. Now, there were what I'm going to call three main components then to the initial opening conflict. The first, of course, was the Belgian river forts. It was very imperative that the Germans attack them, conquer them, and then move on through them to effect their plan because of the very short timeline they were on. Secondly, there was what was referred to as the Battle of the Frontiers. And essentially, these were a series of meeting engagements, which is essentially forces not knowing where the opponent is and then kind of more or less running into one another. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then lastly, when the British were online alongside the French, their first contact with the Germans was in the Belgian town of Mons. So now we'll look at each one of these in just a little more detail and talk about what happened. We'll start with the fortress, the Meuse fortress systems in Belgium. The Belgian forts, as I mentioned, they were very modern. They were well equipped with artillery machine guns. The Belgians did spend a lot of money in placing these forts. On the other hand, they didn't really spend much money on the soldiers that would man them. The soldiers were underfunded, were not really motivated. Morale wasn't particularly high. But again, to the Belgians, that wasn't really their concern at the time. Again, remember, they were a neutral state and more or less hoping that Germans wouldn't come through their way. Now, in 1906, as the Germans were planning this movement through Belgium, they understood well those fortresses would need to be dealt with. So the German army reached out to one of their prominent armaments manufacturers called Krupp, and they requested they develop guns that could defeat these forts. And Krupp produced. In fact, they developed a cannon right before the war began, which the Germans nicknamed the Big Bertha. Now, Bertha Krupp was the daughter of the founder of Krupp Armaments Works, and she was on the plus size of the spectrum. And I understand that she wasn't pleased with the nickname. Again, that could be apocryphal, but that is what I'm sharing with you right now. Secondly, the Germans' Austrian ally developed a cannon as well from their Skoda works, which is still in existence. They're not producing arms anymore, but they're in the present day Czech Republic. Now, these cannons were very powerful and effective, as we'll see. Now, when the Germans first went to Liège, which was the first fortress system that they needed to deal with, they thought they could try and execute a coup de main, that is, a surprise attack and kind of a rush, and just seize these fortresses. Well, the Belgians were ready and prepared. So as the Germans, with very little artillery preparation, launched, they had 8 reinforced, hand-picked infantry brigades, and they were just absolutely devastated. They ran into the cannon and the machine gun fire of the forts. So the German commander, after the end of the day, halted the attacks and then awaited the arrival of the cannons, which were on the way. They were in place, and they went to work, and they essentially destroyed each of the forts within the system in detail. And you can see on the images on the right-hand side of the slide the damage that they affected. After Liège fell, they maneuvered down the Namur, the second fortress system on the river line, and again assembled the artillery, and they went about their destruction. And essentially, that one went very well for the German army. Now, the overall effect, since these fortresses did not stop the Germans, what they did do, though, was they disrupted the timetable and they delayed it. On top of that, they also caused significant casualties initially to the Germans. So they did contribute to the overall Allied war effort in a fairly significant way. Next, Plan 17 was launched. The first victory, if you will, that the Germans effected was the town of Mulhouse, which is located in Lorraine. The French occupied it. The bells rang in Paris, newspaper, banner, headlines, great victory, etc., etc. There was a lot of cheering, a lot of joy and delight throughout France. But unbeknownst to the French, this was part of the German plan. The 6th and the 7th Armies had cavalry screens out with some light artillery supporting them. So as the French came in, they'd fire a few rounds and then they would do a retrograde and pull back while the French advanced. The French thought that they were having great success, but the reality was this was all part of the German plans to draw them in when suddenly they launched their own counterattacks, which absolutely stunned the French. And fighting then occurred up and down the border up and down the border. This battle was extremely violent with incredible physical destruction. And if you can just imagine dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of men, magazine-fed bolt-action rifles supported by continuous firing weapon systems, i.e. machine guns and artillery, clashing in violent struggles up and down. It was just incredibly never seen before conflict with the weapons that these men had at their disposal. Hadn't been seen before. But in line with this, the French doctrine, of course, called for the charge. Remember, this is all about courage and elan. Well, running in a German machine gun and artillery fire did not bode well for these offenses. The Germans won most of the encounters, but again, they were also suffering a lot of heavy casualties. Now, many of the problems the French had was they were not using tactical reconnaissance. They were just sending their soldiers out forward, moving cautiously, if you will, but then running right into the German fire. Also, the French army doctrine was before an attack, there is no artillery preparation. In other words, you don't line up your artillery and shoot at the enemy and then launch your attack. There's no need for that. That's not part of our doctrine. Again, our soldiers will carry the day. And the other issue was the French didn't have any tactical reserves to follow up on any success that they may have achieved. Now, while this is going on, the French Fifth Army up in the north is sending messages back to Joffre that there are substantial German armies marching through Belgium, where Joffre, in his stubbornness, refused to believe it. He thought that was just part of the wartime jitters. The Belgians were saying they're here. And again, Joffre was like, no, I know what I'm doing. And he was pretty much disregarding what his Northern Army was telling him. Well, at this point in time, after the failure of Plan 17, Joffre finally decided that, okay, I have to deal with the North. They are indeed coming through the Low Countries. So he was compelled to cancel Plan 17. Now, that last third major event would be Mons. This would be then the first taste of the first time the British ran into contact with the Germans. It was the First Army under Kluck. Kluck had heard, he had been getting intelligence that the British had landed. And one of the things I really find remarkable here is that the British were able to transport an army, a small army, but they were able to get it across the English Channel with absolutely no impact at all from the German Imperial Navy. They didn't even try. The German Navy didn't even try to interdict this in any way. Now, again, you have to understand the German army developed this plan. They didn't do it in coordination with their admiralty. They didn't even consider them as part of the play, which I find very remarkable because Germany went through a significant economic sacrifice to build this magnificent fleet. But at the hour when war was declared, one of the first things Tirpitz told the Kaiser was the Navy is not ready, which you just kind of have a hard time accepting that. So the man who advocated for this Navy, the man who stated that to be a great power, we have to have this Navy. He was a tremendous organizer. He was very bright. He was a great administrator. But Tirpitz was not what I would call a fighting admiral. You have this remarkable asset, but you have no plan for them at the outset of this great war. Really a remarkable instance within the German Empire. Now, the British Army, again, I mentioned they were regulars. Like the German Army, they were highly motivated, they were well trained, and they were very well disciplined. You know, a trifecta of outstanding soldiers. The British soldiers, though, had an edge over their German adversaries in that they were experienced. In other words, a lot of them were combat veterans. So it's one thing to be motivated, trained, disciplined, etc. But if you're new to war, really not knowing how you react or respond, the Brits, on the other hand, they were combat veterans, and they gave a great accounting for themselves in this particular battle. They were also armed with a magnificent rifle, the Lee Enfield. The British Army emphasized high rates of fire, high rates of accurate fire. They invested a lot in rifle marksmanship. Now, the bolt action on the Enfield, of course, had a very short action, if you will. Flipping the bolt up, back, and forth was a very quick movement, as opposed to the French Lebel and the German Mauser. Now, that may not sound like much of a difference, but when you're talking about thousands of soldiers with high rates of fire, you could see that the British riflemen could turn out a high volume. In fact, at Mons, one German brigade reported that they stumbled upon a British machine gun battalion. Well, they didn't have any machine guns. It was just the rate of fire that those Enfields were turning out. The Germans suffered terrible casualties in this effort, but they carried the day. They ended up overwhelming the British and compelling them to withdraw. Now, at the same time that this was occurring, the Fifth Army was also under attack, and Lanrezac, without informing his British allies, essentially fell back, leaving the British right flank exposed. Now, French saw this as abject betrayal, as opposed to, I'd say, poor form, poor tactical judgment on Lanrezac's part. But again, French took this very personally, and from that point on, he really wanted nothing more to do with Lanrezac or trusted him or any of the French generals altogether. Well, all these actions then turned into what's referred to as the Great Retreat, when the Allies now were falling back. I call this the fog of war now in terms of what was going on. The general staff in Germany were getting these reports from the armies of victories of the French, the British falling back, the Belgian fortress systems falling. So naturally, from their position, the war was weeks away from a successful conclusion. But they were really misreading the situation completely. We'll talk about that a little more later. Now, I want to talk briefly about why the Germans were able to have this tremendous success, and there were several factors. The first one is the non-commissioned officers. The German army had twice as many NCOs as the French. A lot of that has had to do with going back again to service in the German army was one of prestige. It was a point of pride. Where in the French army, yes, they held the army in high regard, but serving in it was just something that you did until you could get on with your life and do something else. So subsequently, a lot of those conscripts in their 2-year commitment did not decide to reenlist or stay within the army. They got out. while consequently, the Germans were able to retain a lot of those conscripts for further military service. The second reason, of course, as we know, the German army was weighted in the north with manpower, like the French were weighted in the south with manpower. So essentially, the Germans had greater numbers of soldiers in the conflicts, in the initial conflicts. The last one is a term I learned from a field artillery officer. He called it weight of metal. And that's essentially how many cannons that each of the formations held within the respective armies. Now, while the French just had their 75 millimeter cannon and didn't really put much energy or thought into development of medium and heavy artillery, the Germans did. And you could see at the bottom there, a German corps, the number of cannons they had compared to a French corps. They had a lot more of them. Now, the French 75 millimeter was superior to the German 77 millimeter. However, they also had another 50 cannons of heavier caliber. Now, I mentioned before the 75 had some limiting factors, and they were significant actually in this particular fight in terms of it was a direct fire weapon which fired a high explosive round. So essentially, it was like a giant shotgun. Now, it did not fire high angle. Well, the German, our howitzers and cannons could fire the high angle, meaning if you knew soldiers were on the other side of a hill or a ridge line, you could put artillery fire on them, and the Germans did extensively. The Germans were much better tactically grounded in terms of fire and maneuver. That is, the maneuver elements, the infantry, the cavalry being supported by the cannons. Integrating those two factors was a significant component of their doctrine and their training, and they used that to tremendous effect. Also notice that the Germans had a greater density of machine guns in each of their battalions, 6 per, while the British and French only had 2 per. And again, we know the machine guns of the era, they were very large, they were very heavy. And so the French, they were not necessarily an offensive weapon. Soldiers were going to drag them forward as they were charging with their bayonets and drums and bugles. So therefore, they thought they were effective weapons, but they didn't have the density of them within their infantry battalions. The Belgians, what they were doing now in this era of the Great Retreat, the first thing Joffre wanted King Albert to do was take the remnants of his army and align them to on the left-hand side of the British Expeditionary Force. So you'd have the Belgians, the British, and then the French armies in a line. King Albert was not going to do that because essentially he knew then he would be giving up Belgian territory forever. The Belgian army would then be pushed back into France in the subsequent battles. He was going to preserve his territorial integrity. So instead, what he did was he evacuated what remained of his army to Antwerp to defend it. Well, he kept getting pushed back until essentially he was able to hang on to a small piece of Belgian soil from where they essentially stayed for the duration of the war. Now, even though it doesn't sound like Belgium had a tremendous role in the conflict, especially these opening stages, that wasn't really true at all. They did attrit the army through casualties, etc. And the other item is Moltke was forced to order Kluck to have one German corps march off to contain Antwerp. And then he also had another corps to go occupy the Belgian capital in Brussels. So you can see a peeling away or an attrition of German strength as that northern wheel was moving through the Low Countries. The French, meanwhile, Joffre, again, stubborn and hard-headed, not willing to, heed the Germans were coming through Belgium. His negative traits, well, now at this point in time in the campaign, his positive traits were really coming into play. The first thing he managed to do was get the French government to essentially allow him to establish what he called an army zone, which essentially moved all the political authority, the civilian authority, out of the zone. Joffre was able to control it completely. In fact, no French minister could enter the zone unless he first had Joffre's permission. And this went for the media as well, which allowed Joffre to control the message, the strategic communications. Now, you have to understand at this point in time, the political authorities in Paris are in total meltdown. Now, even though Joffre is controlling the information coming from the front, there are still many other, communications routes that the leadership was hearing from the territories, the mayors, the provincial governors, and everything of what was occurring. Plus, they could see the hospital trains rolling back into Paris, filled with wounded. So they knew things were not going well. The fact of the matter, though, Joffre was in control. Now, a French racing car, the Grand Prix champion, a gentleman named George Bollot, was an army reservist, and he shortly found himself as Joffre's driver. And Joffre used this racing car champion to motor around to all his armies and face to face with his army commanders, tell them exactly what he expected them to do. And there were oftentimes, in fact, there was one time in particular, he gave an army commander an order face to face, and he hung around his headquarters for the next 6 hours, ensuring that his orders were carried out. Again, remarkable man, remarkable situation, but the man for the job. The second thing Joffre did was he just began firing commanders that he thought were not fit, were not showing the proper attitude, if you will, or not essentially carrying out his orders. We talked about the army commanders that he relieved, 3 Corps and 31 division commanders just gone. He sent them back to a garrison town named Limoges, and they got the nickname of the Limoges, which essentially meant you were fired and now you're back here. Essentially, what the French army, as they were cashiering these officers, they were keeping them on active duty because they may not be good fighting men, but they can certainly still lend their expertise to the war effort. The other thing that Joffre began doing then was taking forces from the southern armies and transferring them rapidly up to the north in order to then hold off the German attack. He ordered the armies to reposition back to the French fortress lines and man them. Now, they were at reduced strength and not at the pre-war planning levels. But again, Joffre was using what you call economy of force. That is leaving lesser forces to hold while you take the bulk and go do something else. Joffre was also in the process of generating new forces, reserves, volunteers, colonial units. The French army had a very substantial colonial army throughout their empire, and they were all being brought in. In fact, he had 60,000 soldiers, and they were ethnically white that were stationed in the colonies, the Chasseurs, the Zouaves, and of course, most famously, the Foreign Legion. These soldiers were coming in. And again, they were highly motivated, well-trained, highly disciplined, and in many cases, they were combat veterans as well. Very effective soldiers. Now, the point I want to make here, the French had been beaten badly, but they weren't defeated. This French army was going to fight. These soldiers would have made Louis XIV, the Sun King, Napoleon Bonaparte, very proud. Again, they were determined and they fought very well. And the resiliency they displayed was incredible. Now, the British, they did well at Mons, but again, they were overwhelmed through strength of numbers. But their commanding officer, on the other hand, was completely overwhelmed. Now, you remember, again, I mentioned before, he didn't really give a lot of thought to the new weapons technology that was coming in the line. And the fighting, the chaos, the violence, it just overwhelmed him. He was in way over his head. He was also too overly sensitive to the soldiers. Again, they as they stumbled back on the Great Retreat, they looked in bad shape. But the reality was they were just fine. They just needed some rest and reorganization, and they would have been prepared to go back into battle. But what French was doing was making noises about moving the army back to the French ports, embarking and returning to the British Isles. Well, when word of that got out, that caused these subsequent visits to his headquarters. The first one was Joffre, with Lanrezik, the 5th Army commander, on the 26th of August. And I just ask you to picture this moment. Now, Lanrezik and Joffre were both big, burly men. They were wearing their blue uniforms with brass buttons, and truth be told, they looked like train station masters. Then you have French. He's a field marshal. He was short stature, kind of, no, he's a peacock, essentially, is what he was. Now, Joffre, as a general, could not give the field marshal an order. Field marshal is a 5-star general. Joffre is a 4-star general. Now, of course, Joffre could ask, implore as an ally, et cetera, et cetera. It was up to French whether he wanted to adhere to it or not. Now, French saw the Field Marshal French saw the 2 Frenchmen as commoners, which they were. They were not landed. They were not titled. He again felt betrayal by Lanrezik, and he didn't trust Joffre's orders given the failure of Plan 17. So the meeting did not end well, but French did agree, okay, I will stop my army, but you're going to have to give me 10 days before I can advance back into the fight, which again was not the answer Joffre wanted. French invited Joffre and Lanrezik for lunch. Lanrezik blew out of there. He's too busy, wanted nothing to do with French. Joffre, of course, would never turn down a meal. He stayed, and they had lunch. Now, the end of that meeting was essentially French agreeing to, okay, I will halt, I will rest, refit, reorganize, and then I will get back into the fight. Not necessarily what Joffre needed here at this stage, but better than nothing. I want to get to the heart of what occurred now at this point in time. The German army, General Staff Headquarters, did not have a clear picture of what was going on. They sensed what they thought was going on. The 6th and 7th armies in the south, again, the static position they were supposed to hold did not suit them well. In fact, the Crown Prince of Bavaria said, we have to get into this fight, and therefore we want to attack. Moltke did not have the temerity to tell the Crown Prince no. So essentially, Moltke delivered orders for a double envelopment with the 6th and the 7th Army participating. The problem with this then, it was illogical. The Germans did not want to attack through the French fortress system based on the Vosges Mountains in their decades of war planning because of the impossibility of such a thing. But that's essentially what he gave them permission to do, and those attacks all failed. On top of that, you can see the amount of corps, 5 corps that had to go off into other missions. So essentially, the West-Aufmarsch plan, the intent at the beginning was discarded. West-Aufmarsch essentially translates to strategic deployment west. So if you want to call this plan anything, that is what you would call it, and not the Schieffelin plan. The friction points, Moltke was in a headquarters in Koblenz. I showed you what that headquarters was. It wasn't a fighting headquarters. It was an imperial court. It wasn't something that you could have effective command and control over this operation. Therefore, Moltke was out of contact. The communications they had at the time could not handle then the distances involved. On top of that, the French were able to successfully block a lot of the radio telegraph transmissions, the introduction of electronic warfare at this point. The communications, I mentioned that it was ineffective. They had radios. They were very heavy, cumbersome, unreliable. And again, the German intent to rely on the local telephone exchanges, of course, did not work out because the Belgians and French were destroying them in stride. The second thing, the German army on the march, you could see the footprint of an army corps, the amount of soldiers and horses, the movement rates, etc. That little block on the right-hand side, I want to show you. The Germans, as they marched along in the evening when they were done with the marching, would then have to then go out to the flanks in order to set up defensive positions overnight, which is added then to the miles that these soldiers were walking. The soldiers and horses were falling out by the thousands. And it essentially The attrition then of the German armies as they were marching was significant. The sustainment, again, you see the core footprint, how large it was, the impact. The horses, magnificent animal. However, they require a significant amount of daily fodder. 2/3 of the supply wagons were hauling nothing but fodder, with a straw and hay, which was a filler, and then another few pounds of oats or grain, which is the nutrition and vitamins for the horses. But again, this was running out. The transport trucks were 60% inoperable. They started out with 3,700. They were breaking down, and the sustainment issue was getting to be a significant factor, which then essentially led to then the defeat, which was Moltke issuing orders then, a continuation of double envelopment. The Fluke failed to find the poor reconnaissance of the French forces amassing on his flank. They began the attack. Fluke was able to turn his corps around and offset the attack, but at the same time, a gap was opening between the first and the second armies, and fighting up and down the line occurred, but the French line held. And then there was an infamous visit from Hensch. The bottom line here, the point I want to make, this wasn't Hensch's fault. It wasn't Moltke's fault. It was Bulow. Bulow was the individual that said, nope, we need to withdraw. Fluke did not think so. It was Bulow who made the decision to withdraw, which compelled Fluke to withdraw as well. Again, Bulow was a 68-year-old general, and at this time he was pretty much played out. And that began, of course, the race to the sea. Not going to get into that. I want to go to my, map the what ifs and conclusion. So the failure, right here, wrapped up here. I just end on this one. The federal system, concentration of power with the Kaiser. It would take a unique individual to be able to hold all his duties and responsibilities and be effective. Moltke was in over his head, poor health, and the requisite power centers and empowerment that they had, which allowed them to essentially to do what they felt best. The army commanders, I mentioned the age and illness. The crown princes demanding their role of glory in the offensive, and Moltke's inability to tell the crown prince no. The army commanders also fought their battles as individuals, not part of a grand strategic plan. The idea they were going for individual glory and honor. Communications mentioned that the German army could have invested significantly more in comms. They chose to concentrate it on the three principal warfighting arms. And sustainment was not realistic. And the false assumption that the Belgian and French rail system would be intact, bridges, telephone exchanges would all be available. Of course, they weren't, because they were being destroyed as the Great Retreat occurred. So here are my references, which I used. And lastly, are there any comments?
Patrick, very, very good. That was an exhaustive view of the first couple of months of the war. I recommend also to you the book, The Ring of Fire, which has just come out. We had a lecture by its authors at the museum night before last, and I think also deals with much the same period of time.
I'd also I'd offer it anybody, if you want the slide deck, I'd be happy to turn it over to you, or any book recommendations here. This On a Knife Edge. This is a German author. It's a German point of view. Outstanding book. You may not agree with everything in it, but it really is an excellent perspective of the German side, how they saw things. Very well balanced and a great read. We too often read the British and American historians and their takes on things. This perspective was outstanding. And lastly, the heart of the book, this one here, The Marne. This author, again, really great book in terms of the opening campaign. It's called The Marne, but it's about the opening of the war, the frontier battles, and everything else.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending the lecture.